All right, we are live. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this month. Um, I'm just going to start off with appreciations and say, I appreciate everyone who joins this regularly because, at least for me, selfishly, it gives me an outlet to kind of stay connected with the rest of the world. So, and hear everyone's perspectives and solutions and interesting stuff. So, thank you all for that. This month, we've been on a roll with actually having guests. And we've had some interesting conversations. So this month, I guess, long-time listener, first-time caller, Sam Keeley is going to join us. And Sam, why don't you just tell us what you are up to and what you are doing and how life is working for you?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm a reformed MacAdmin, maybe de facto MacAdmin still, I don't know. But I've been a security engineer at Airbnb for the last 5 years or so. Kind of still working on client engineering and user-facing services and enablement. So this year has been pretty crazy with shifting ways of working and how we can enable users to work while at the same time doing it in a secure manner. And I think optimally we've if I'm doing my job right, we find solutions that elevate our user experience and our security. So that's kind of what I've in a sense what I've been up to recently. But
So,
things change every week.
when you started, did you start in that role as a security in security, or did you start more in IT and make the transition?
So when I started at Airbnb, it was the IT security team.
Okay.
And there were actually a couple of roles open. I could have, taken the one that was well defined as like a client engineering role or a security engineering role. And I had found myself in previous roles being basically like de facto on the security team. And I enjoyed that a lot. So I was like, why don't we just flip this around? So for years, I guess I've been a de facto member of what ended up being the client engineering team at Airbnb. As that team has grown, my role has shifted, but um, we all kind of we're all generalists at some level, and we all kind of blend our responsibilities at some point. But you know, I'm I'm listening to WWDC as much as everyone else on this call still is. So
Yeah. Yeah, because I think you're right. Like, it's an interesting um, shift because IT really kind of sets you up for a security role in a lot of ways. I think if you're doing it right, and particularly remember sort of when I was working at smaller companies and you have to do everything, right? You're much more involved in everything. Like, yeah, sure, I set up servers when you want to set them up securely, but I was
mhm.
also setting up the firewall and connecting to the internet and like all these other things, and creating policies and password policies. Um, so even though your title isn't security, it's something you're always involved in, and I think it's a great stepping stone or training ground to get into a sort of like a real security role.
Yeah. But even with like a real security role, like I don't really think that there's very much of a difference at all beyond maybe title and org structure.
Mm.
Um, at least within the organizations that I've worked at, between like the security team and like IT engineering.
Mm.
There might be like slightly different motivations, but ultimately, if a security organization is doing its job right, um, at least in my mind, it's putting like it's putting security as not like, hey, we're going to lock everything down. It's more of enabling users to work to get their jobs done in the best way that also elevates their security posture. So yeah, I don't really even know if you ask me what the difference is between like a security team and like a good IT engineering team. I'd probably say that there's none at all, or maybe it's that security has to be the bad guys once in a while, but that shouldn't happen very often.
Okay. Well, you beat me to the punch because I was going to ask you that, but uh, I guess that you brought up something else that makes a nice transition in terms of empowering people to be able to do their job and their security posture. Obviously, here we are, 2020. A lot has happened, and shifts have happened, and people who used to be in offices have all gone remote and are working from home. Possibly their homes, or sometimes they have a cabin out in the woods or something, and they're working from their second home, or something along those lines. How well were you prepared to deal with that, or were there just sort of emergency measures taken, or what did that shift to remote look like for you?
I think, there were obviously things that we had to do where there was very little planning and we kind of just did stuff. Um, but we'd largely been moving in this direction, not in like having people work from home, but having the infrastructure there and kind of the technologies in place so that people could work from home. Um, we weren't necessarily like building things with that first in mind, but people have been able to, work from home occasionally, and get to all the things that they need to get to for a very long time. Like I think most companies have had VPNs or some other solution in place that allows at a technical level that to happen. Um, Maybe not for all roles or in a way that has people actually being productive. Um, but the basis was always there. Um, so for us, it was more about capacity and performance and less about like, hey, we need all this new stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, a lot of companies definitely have VPNs in place, but now they send everyone home, and their VPN head ends are kind of melting down because they didn't plan to have their entire workforce suddenly being out of the office and needing to get back in. Would you say you're largely cloud-based and kind of were able to avoid a lot of that, or was that something that you had to sort of scale up?
I mean, it's largely a mix. So um, I think like a lot of similar companies, um, using SaaS products, um, a lot of employees at you know companies that have been founded in the last 10 or 15 years can already do pretty much their entire job without ever connecting to a VPN.
Thank you.
Um, if you're using G Suite or you've got Okta or OneLogin or one of these SSO portals with all these SAML apps, most of those apps probably don't have network restrictions. Um, Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't, but yeah, most users probably don't need to connect to a VPN. Um, and so I think for us and for organizations that I'm aware of, like there's a very similar setup,
Hmm.
where it just hasn't been that big of a deal. Um, like I spoke last year about moving access to a lot of internal applications behind Google IAP, and that does replace VPN access, but um, so many apps would never really be behind a solution like that because they aren't hosted internally by us. They aren't hosted, in our AWS or in our on-prem colos or something like that. The modern world is largely SaaS based, And so I think VPNs kind of aren't important for most users anymore, except for like that one thing that they have to get to that is some legacy service that's running on, something.
Yeah,
Um,
agree with that. And I mean, I still say this. I know I've said it before, but like, I think this group is, and people that listen to us like are largely sort of in the know on that type of architecture, zero trust or beyond corp or whatever you want to call it. But there are still a lot of people that I talk to that when I say zero trust or describe that architecture, how it could be, like they just have this light bulb moment of like, oh, wow, like there are so many companies that are still very, oh, I don't want to conflate these two things, but they're very like, they're all still on like Windows 7 and they have their VPNs set up and like things work and they're not looking to change it. Um, and some of them, are pretty large companies that like they just move very slowly. And maybe I'll find one of those people one day and we can ask them what their transition was like. But yeah, still like a lot of on-prem, servers and applications. So uh, pretty interesting. Pretty interesting.
well, if your VPN concentrator or gateways are getting crushed, um, a good gateway into getting your things into the cloud is, putting your monkey repos um, in S3 or some other cloud bucket behind a CDN and getting that traffic off of your VPN. It can be hard to do that if your VPN is full tunnel, but I think most VPNs that I'm aware of now that are enterprisey support DNS exclusions. So you can say it's full tunnel, except don't route this over it. And that's something that we've definitely had to do. We still have a VPN. Every company that says they're like Beyond Corp, they still have a VPN, and it's still going to get crushed by, giant packages coming over it, or video conferencing.
Yeah.
So there's motivations to do it that can save you hundreds of thousands of dollars on buying new refrigerator-sized VPN gateways to put in some rack somewhere.
Yeah.
Like if you can get it down to just your SSH or just some file server that's hosting Word docs running over your VPN, you probably don't need to invest in giant hardware.
True. So in your role, I guess like we talk a lot about the tool sets that Mac admins would use. Can you talk a little bit about the tool set that you are using sort of day to day? Like what are the main things that you end up relying on in a
So
security focused role?
sure. So I would say that really the overlap is basically 100% on the tools that I rely on to do my job, which faces like Mac OS versus what a typical versus like what just like a straight client engineer might end up using. They might be motivated in slightly different ways. But we use Monkey and Puppet and MicroMDM and OS Query. Those are the big tools that we use. I use them for what I need to do, and our client engineering team uses them for what they need to do. And of course, there's a ton of overlap in that. So I don't really do very much with Monkey anymore because we pretty much automated it all. It's just patching. But if we have some configuration that we need to ensure is there, like that's going, like I will put that in Puppet or I will put that in MicroMDM. And then to audit the state of things, OS Query has been really great for us at that. Now, I think OS Query is probably the most interesting tool there for kind of having had its inception as a security tool, and then over time turning into more than that. So when we first rolled out OS Query, I don't know, 4 years ago here, it was really only used by the security team. It was, yet another security tool. But I insisted on some things that we did there to make sure that it didn't stay always that way. And the biggest thing there was making sure that the configuration that we use for OS Query be open on our internal version control system. So it's not a black box. You can see what information is being gathered on a device, and if someone sees OS Query D on their Mac eating up 99% of their CPU, well, maybe that's happening to more than one device, and we can see what changed, right? And I made sure that it was transparent, and then started selling it to other teams as like, hey, this can solve some problems that you might be having. We're not fully there. I don't know if we're ever going to be fully there. Is like, this is not a security tool. But it's at least at this point, it's a security tool that other teams are using for productive things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's only so many agents you want on an endpoint, right? Like,
right.
You can look at it two ways. You might want all the agents, but that's not going to be helpful for your end user. But yeah, you want to constrain them, and if you have tools in common, fantastic. So yeah, that's speaking of endpoints. I guess we have a few transitions in the Apple world coming up, and the first one of those is, kernel extensions done.
And maybe it's
maybe. Tell me about some of the work you've done with that, or if you're looking into that transition, or if your tools are sort of ready for that world.
I think it's a bit of a blur. So we've tried to move ourselves to tools that don't rely on kernel extensions. There's still some reliance on them, but that will largely fade away within the next few months. I think we've known that they've been going away, or questionably going away. They've been going somewhere, which, maybe it's just reboots. Maybe nothing's clear. I'm more confused about kernel extensions than I was earlier this year as to what their state is, and like what the deprecations actually are. It seems like the change right now is that you just have to reboot to make them load, but I don't really know. We know that they're not a great thing to have around, and we've known that for a long time, so we've largely moved away from them, or had plans to.
Okay. Have you? Yeah, I'm sure. Then, from like a security perspective, you've looked at the move to security extensions.
System extensions and the endpoint security framework are very interesting.
Yep.
I've looked at what we can do with them, and I think we can do everything that we would want to do. Right now, we're kind of in this phase of asking ourselves if the things that we've done in the past are things that we still need to be doing, and kind of reviewing what we have, instead of just being like, hey, we were doing this with the Kext. We were doing this with the Kext for the past 6 years. Should we be doing this? And setting ourselves up for the future, instead of just binding our dependencies to what we've done in the past and being like, oh, here's this vendor that they updated their thing to a system extension, so great, we'll be good with that forever. So I think it's a really good point in time to review what you're doing and if you need to be doing it.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's always good to review and make sure you're not doing something just because you've always done it.
Mhm.
The other big transition, of course, is Apple Silicon, right? Um, I presume you got one of the dev boxes.
I do have a DTK. I am not using it right now because it's a few miles away. But yeah, I'm really excited by Apple Silicon. Um, I think first as a user and secondly for security, like there's definite security benefits to it. Um, based off Apple's investments into, the the boot chain and like how all of that works. Um, I think a lot of that we've realized on T2 Max, um, and even kind of on T1 Max. Um, but I'm mostly just excited from the performance aspect. So I don't know if my MacBook like heard that a DTK came in the house, but it just decided that it was going to start getting slower and hotter and slower and slower. Kind of reminds me of what happened to my PowerBook. Um, but I'm just really excited from the performance side. Apple says that they're not like they weren't even trying and shoving the A12X or A12Z into a Mac Mini form factor. But that thing already blows my MacBook Pro like away.
Wow.
And so I don't think that this year buying a revision A Apple Silicon Mac will be a bad choice.
Huh.
Buying a revision A MacBook Pro probably wasn't a good idea. Those things, like, they were cool for a minute, but like they were not good computers. I truly believe that the first Apple Silicon Macs will be great computers.
Yeah.
And I would not buy an Intel Mac right now.
Yeah, it's interesting having a completely different architecture under the hood for your main computer. Just as far as like differentiating it from Windows or most Linux boxes. I mean, obviously Linux runs on ARM,
Mm-hmm.
etc. I guess there's a Windows on ARM, but it's just not very popular, or it has some strange licensing or something. But it's really the first major processor shift for like a consumer desktop machine in I don't know, I guess since the last time Apple did a big shift, right?
Yeah, but even then, like 15 years ago, like there weren't a ton of Mac. There weren't like 100 million Macs out there.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I don't know what the numbers are, but there's definitely like 10 or 20 or 30 times as many Macs in the world as there were back then.
Well, yeah,
Um,
there's
but they
that.
didn't
Like,
last as long.
yeah, I mean, I'll admit, like, I was definitely sort of disappointed that Apple was transitioning to Intel from PowerPC. I mean, it solved a number of things, absolutely. And you're right, the greater numbers now almost mean Apple doesn't care, or they know they're not sort of like Windows is still the vast majority of desktops in the enterprise.
Mhm.
And maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll see like dual booting or something one day, but I think Apple's realized like we just don't care, right? We're just, that's not the market that we're going after. Like the people who are buying Macs overwhelmingly are buying them to use as Macs. Um, but yeah, it was definitely different going from PowerPC to Intel because you were kind of going to the more popular or more common consumer chip. Um, yeah, I definitely kind of hated that back in the day
Yeah.
because we were definitely gonna kind of going to the crappier of the two architectures. Definitely, like I love the PowerPC, like just everything about it, like just the floating point ran circles around Intel at the time. You had so many more registers to use when you're like writing assembly or something, and it's just like Intel, like it was such a disappointment. But Yeah, I'm definitely.
It took it like 5 years for them to be good.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I am excited though to see what Apple can build controlling the whole stack. Like it looks like it's going to be an Apple GPU as well, right? Like I
Yeah,
don't think they're
and
announcing like, oh yeah, we're going to have AMD
they
or any.
haven't announced any of that. I think it's pretty obvious that the first Apple Silicon Macs will be portables that have whatever Apple graphics are on them. But um, I don't think that Apple built eGPU support into Mac OS to throw it away like a year or two later.
No, I'd agree with that, but I don't think they'll be shipping anything by default, right? That'll be a
Yeah,
choice for you to go stick in some other graphic card or something like that. I mean, what else are Bitcoin miners going to do?
yeah.
You need your 2080 or whatever we're up to now. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think I'm also excited about that as a prospect, though, that it should definitely be better than whatever Intel Iris or whatever the Intel graphics chip is in sort of like lower end Macs. And Apple will clearly like make it run really well with Metal and all of their graphics technologies. So that could be really interesting.
Yeah,
Because
like I've loaded Civilization 6 on my DTK, and um, the performance that gets in Rosetta 2 is amazing.
that's mind blowing. That's mind blowing.
Um,
People are seeing such great performance even through translation.
like the so that's it's a Metal 2 game, so the graphics aren't translated; they're direct run. But the CPU instructions are translated. But I would rather play that game on the DTK right now than I would on my MacBook.
Wow, that's that says something, man. That's really impressive.
I don't think I'm allowed to say anything about benchmarks or whatever, but I would rather play it on my DTK. Maybe it's because it's hooked up to a nicer monitor,
That
but
would be true too.
who knows?
So, what sort of a typical day look like for you, or a typical week? Uh, from the security perspective.
So I would say right now it's kind of trying to refocus on what I was trying to focus on earlier this year before COVID happened, and then blending the COVID stuff in and thinking about with everyone working from home for some indeterminate amount of time, can we still do the things that we want to, or what can we embrace to move that ahead? So one of the things that we're working on right now um, is kind of to complete a project that we started 4 years ago, which was around security keys and having all of our authentication being done through security keys. Um, the majority of our authentication happens through a physical security key today. The majority of our users are using them. And I think they're a really great user experience. But we have some hurdles there. We have some hurdles there, but also things that were exciting that happened this year. Like Apple finally adding web authentication support to Safari,
Yay.
although it has caveats, which Victor, who's on the call here, definitely we've griped about together. But that's something that's very exciting and allows us to move forward. Apple adding platform authentication support to Safari, also very exciting. Maybe not just from like an internal use case, but for like a general web use case. Like Apple adds support for something, and finally it might get embraced on the web, moving it from a niche thing to a more widespread thing. So for us, like we've had this logistical challenge of how do you get security keys out to everybody that doesn't have one? Like most of our users have them already, but if I've got like, I don't know, a few thousand users who don't have one, or the one that they have, is USB-A, and now they have a USB-C device, or they want to use it with their iPhone, so they need one that has NFC on it. Where previously we could just, stand in the office and be like, here, come get one, and have a little kiosk or something. Now we have logistics of like, how do you mail things to everybody and like make sure they enroll them properly? But we're kind of just moving ahead on finishing initiatives that we started. Because it's really easy to start things. It's really hard to get them to 100%. Because you always want to start something new, or you always hit edge cases of browsers that don't work with what you want, or platforms that don't work with what you want. So it's like a lot of time figuring out internal issues, but also working with, the companies that make the software that you're dealing with, and investing the time with them to make sure that those solutions are going to work for you. What I found is if you stay on the bleeding edge, you can get what you want. It might take a lot longer sometimes than what you had really hoped for. But if you stay on the bleeding edge, that's the easiest way to influence products to be the way that you want them to be.
Yeah. Yeah, true.
People think you're crazy, but it's always kind of fun. If you're keeping yourself like a few years behind, then you just kind of have to deal with whatever exists.
Yes.
And I've never been able to really accept that.
It's a good philosophy. So I'll wrap up with, I guess, sort of a personal question, and that's, you mentioned working from home and everyone's working from home. How is this for you? Because you live on planes. You joined MacAdmin Monthly from a plane once.
Yeah, I think I've joined it like over the Atlantic before.
You definitely have.
And it's strange for me. I haven't been on a plane since March 13th on the way back from Objective by the Sea in Maui.
And let's stop and talk about that for a second. Like how lucky was Patrick Wardle, because if that was scheduled for a week later, it would have been shut down.
Yeah,
right. Like it was under the wire. It was the last conference I think anyone in sort of like this circle attended, because.
Yeah, I remember sitting there on the Friday there and like looking around and just being like, I think this is the last time I'm going to see anyone work related for a really long time.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know how long it was going to be. I think at the time it was like, oh, we're going to shut down for 2 weeks. And like, remember that. But, now I don't really know.
Yeah.
So I think I've had a lot of experience of like working from home and like the pains of it. But it's worked out.
Yeah.
I keep buying plane tickets and then canceling them because I can't go yet. I really want to go back to California and get all the clothes that I left there, but I can just buy new ones. I'll go back eventually. But it's good to be home with people during this time.
Yeah. Definitely. There's a certain amount of it that I definitely appreciate. And I have a younger daughter who's getting ready to go off to uni, and it's been nice that she's home almost all the time, and I'm getting to spend more time with her than we probably would have otherwise before she goes off. So in like another week, I'm going to be driving her upstate. But at the same time, I definitely cannot wait until I can kind of travel to an office and see my teammates, and go to a conference in person with people, and see all of you and all the other people kind of that I usually see at these events, just because you just get so much more out of it. and we'll get there. We'll get there. That's the good news. But I think you're right. Like, who knows? Like, I definitely remember, offices closing, and then schools closed first, I think, even before offices. And schools were like, yeah, we're going to be closed for the next 2 days. And then it came out this week, and then the month, and then who knows? So yeah, there was definitely a period of like, oh, we're going to knock this thing out. And yet here we are. So great. Thanks. I think that's super interesting. Anyone else on the stream here have questions, or I'll keep my eye on the Slack channel and see if anyone has questions for Sam while we got you here.
Yeah, I'm curious, as a security engineer, how much of what you learn about attacks do you share with your client engineering team? Like, when you verified for a fact, like, something happened, or you've detected something using the tools that you use daily, how much of that goes directly to your client engineering team?
So I would say, like, as much as makes sense. I don't deal with incident response directly. I'm not on that team. I'm very aware of what goes on, but I think there's a lot of noise, and you don't want to like overload people. But the things that are interesting are what gets shared around. If you're like, every day it caught some like generic malware or like something like that, it's not interesting. And you want to just kind of be able to justify what you're doing and make sure that when someone sees, some process in their activity monitor taking up 2% of their CPU, they see value in it. So I would say focusing on the interesting stuff is way better than just being like, here's a report with a million lines and like, trying to like justify points, or like kind of classic reporting that I've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, as a Mac admin, whenever I interact with security, is like, we have all of these agents and tools that we kind of think are useless, but then I talk to them and they're like, oh, like on a given day, it stops like so many executions of like this thing that you would never think people would be stupid. It would be like, we run Santa on the fleet, and people would be like, look what they tried to approve today, right? Because they think they know better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like my perspective changes after having those conversations, because like those tools do end up being useful, even if they're stopping like garden variety nonsense, because yeah, like we just don't think about it because it's taken care of. And
yeah, I think the most important thing there is making sure that the client engineering team or whoever is responsible for installing these tools sees value in them. Because if you don't see value in them, then that kind of stigma spreads to the rest of the users, and you need to have a good relationship. Because if you're just like, I don't know what this stuff does, it never really works out. People are going to remove it. They're going to keep it from working. So either things need to be completely out of your way and taking up zero resources, which is not realistic, or seen as having value by real users and by IT. So I kind of try to do that with OS Query, and that's worked out. Other tools which are like purely security focused are going to be a lot harder to kind of cross over, but it's definitely possible.
I'm going to ask a question from the chat. Is all patching on end user Mac OS devices handled automatically? Or do you put some of the burden on the user for enacting updates? For example, restarting Chrome to finish an update. If some onus is on the user, do you find that to be generally effective?
So what I would say with patching on Mac OS or Windows or really anything, is that having a good story around automatic updates is way more important, or like a very important thing to prioritize before you enforce things around updates. So if you can't hit a threshold of like 90% of your devices getting updated by what your enforcement time would be, you're just going to ruin the user experience. So we do set all of our Macs to automatically update. If you go into system preferences and go to whatever that pref pane is, all of the boxes are going to be checked, and they have been checked for years. And Apple's auto updates on macOS do work pretty well. If you have a terminal window open with a process running, they're not going to run. So there is some burden on users where the automatic updates don't work. But for the vast majority of users, it's already going to have happened. Yes, we block out-of-date Macs, but if a significant number of users are getting blocked because their devices are out of date, that's a problem. I'm never happy when somebody gets blocked for being out of date on a machine that we own, right? Like if someone tries to log into something on some like random Windows XP machine and they're blocked because it's super out of date, like I'm pretty happy that happened. But if it's happening on a machine that we own and manage, like that's not great. So taking advantage of the built-in automatic updating tools within Chrome or Mac OS or Windows is really important. And it's super easy. They pretty much just work.
How do you guys handle third-party software dependencies that maybe aren't ready for the new updates?
That's been a struggle. I don't know if it's been a struggle, but it's been something that we've dealt with over the years. I would say that in my experience, it takes about 2 years to bring an organization to the point where they will be ready to update all of their Macs from day one to a new OS. Whether that's having procedures in place to make sure things get tested, or moving vendors to ones that actually release updates in a reasonable amount of time. I think it's just a kind of a long process. I've been through it multiple times, but that's kind of what we do, is like having a good testing process in place. And yeah, there might be some bugs that exist on day one on a new version of Mac OS. But the last version of Mac OS also had a ton of bugs. So we kind of just deal with it that way, by moving our vendor relationships to ones that actually respect Mac OS. And I don't think it's been a huge problem for us anymore.
Do you have an exception process in place for people who are dependent on some piece of software to do their job that is not going to be updated?
We have had an exception process, but I think in the last couple of years, so we have that there, like, just in case, but I don't think it's really been used.
That's good to hear.
Like you should have the technical means for that. But yeah, if it's being taken advantage of at any, then more than the number of fingers you have, then probably something went wrong in your testing process.
Speaking of the testing process, then, do you put people on beta OSs, like maybe a testing pool of people on the beta OS, so you can get some sort of real world feedback before GA?
Yes. Yeah, so that's part of the process that's kind of been put in place over the last couple of years. So I think I said before, it takes a couple of years to get to the point where you're ready for things on day one, but you're not fully ready. It took maybe another couple of years beyond that to be yeah, actually we are 100% ready or 99% ready. So we do have a program where we encourage users to sign up. We seek out representation from different teams. So it's not just when we did this 3 years ago, it was just a few people in IT, as well as some random iOS developers who wanted to run the new Xcode, and they were like, well, I might as well install the new macOS beta as well. So I don't really know what the percentage is, but it's enough of a number where things are caught.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
we're able to deal with them ahead of time. But having a program there where you can encourage people to update. Basically, I think the way that we've done it the last year or two is like, we're like, you probably shouldn't update on like the first day. Like, I will update and like people on the client engineering will update, and we'll figure out what is like broken, and we'll fix the broken stuff like within a day or two, and then go ahead, or we'll at least like know like, hey, authorization plugins are broken. This is what you got to do. But I think by the time like the second or third beta rolls around, we have, you know, tens to hundreds of people on it.
Wow.
And I would very much encourage organizations to run betas, not just during the summer, but throughout the year, because Apple does make major changes in the spring and at other times as well. So that's kind of something that we've kept up with.
Yeah, totally agreed. Yeah, you should have some portion of people on that can put up with some pain on those sort of the Appleseed betas just sort of year round.
Mm-hmm. But they'll probably get new memojis
Yeah.
early. Yeah. So like install the beta profile.
Yeah. Speaking of memojis, then I guess that raises another good question. Are you also responsible for iOS or just sort of like traditional desktop platforms?
So I would say that yes, but iOS is kind of like a not like, it doesn't have quite the resources attached to it that macOS does. Just because for us, it's still not really seen as like a primary work platform. It might be over time if like iPads get embraced, but they never really have been. So iOS is still for us more of like, hey, it's your phone and you have your chat and your email and like you can get to some stuff from it more than like a place that people actually work from. But we do a few.
Do you actually buy those devices, or are they just BYOD and you don't care?
We manage them, but we do it lightly. I don't want to intrude upon your personal iOS device. So like we don't do a bunch of stuff. I don't want to lock down your phone. I mostly just want to have the confidence that it's actually up to date. It's not jailbroken, and like that we can remove access to your work data from it. So I think what I'm really hopeful for on iOS is that user enrollment becomes a thing that actually gets used. And that was something that I was really disappointed about at WWDC, is that last year, Apple made a big deal about user enrollment and how like MDM needs to change and like the way companies treat like mobile devices needs to change. And it kind of just like didn't really work unless you were in the golden path, and there's still so many things that just don't work. And so I was really hopeful that things would be announced regarding user enrollment this year at WWDC, and there was zero. Or at the same time, we see really cool stuff with work profiles on Android. And like, that's what we want on iOS. Maybe not work profiles exactly, but I think that's a much more realized vision than what user enrollment is. And like managed Apple IDs with federation and all this. Like maybe in a couple of years we'll be able to do cool stuff on iOS, but like for now it's still just this like, okay, it has your email on it, whatever. It's what people need it to be, and right now they don't need it to be very much because they can't do a ton.
Yeah. Makes sense. Cool. Any other questions for Sam? I will take your silence as no. Thanks, Sam. I appreciate you taking the time to kind of dig into what you're doing and really thoughtful answers. Sounds like a great approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if this were a year ago, we'd be talking about conferences and what conferences are coming up. And yeah, we don't really have that luxury so much anymore, but I know a bunch of conferences have gone virtual. I did not watch the Penn State ones. I'm curious if anyone did. It looked like they were interesting and went well, but I can't give you a review because I didn't watch them. And it sounds like no one here did either.
I tuned into a couple sessions. I thought it was well presented in the digital format. Like, I'm sure it wasn't as impactful as it is to be there in person, but I did feel like there was still like some good quality talks that got presented, and they were very well organized.
Well, it's good to know. I mean, they're professionals. They've been doing this for a long time. And I'm sure they had some good thoughts on how to present it. In fact, I did like that they approached it differently. It wasn't just going to be like, hey, we have this week scoped out, and then we're just going to drop everything on the week. They kind of spaced it out much further than they normally do, which I thought was kind of cool. But trying to think of what's coming up next. Mac Sysadmin's the only one jumping to mind as the next sort of like Mac-based conference. Normally, I would say I'm speaking there, but I'm pre-recording a video to be shown there, not actually speaking. So that's going to be an interesting endeavor, I think. Hopefully, I can have some fun with video that I wouldn't be able to have live. So we'll see how that works.
I think it's interesting, the pre-recording versus live, and then some conferences are having a mix of that, and seeing how that all works out. There's been a lot of experiments this year.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad people are sort of like feeling it out and poking at the edges and figuring out kind of what works best for their audiences. We just wrapped up a week with Black Hat and DEF CON. Some things went well, some things less so. I don't know. I find like the frustrating thing with any virtual conference is that maybe it's just me, but like I haven't scoped out the time for it. If I was going to a conference, I'm out of the office, I'm at the conference, sitting in the audience, trying to pay attention. Whereas with the virtual conferences, I'm sitting in front of the same screen I always sit in front of. And you don't really take off from work to attend these conferences. So someone gets you on Slack or, whatever. And before you know it, you're sort of like back to work rather than watching conference videos. So I don't know. I've found that really kind of difficult to actually scope out the time to attend any of these conferences. So I think that's the other.
I did like the way that Mac DevOps YVR ended up. I think the smaller niche conferences work out better as virtual conferences. If you looked at DEF CON, it had a similar setup where they used Discord.
Yeah.
But it was just too many people. Like, I like being at conferences where I don't know a lot of the people. Like, I don't need to know everybody because then that's kind of boring. But I like to know somebody that's within like 20 feet of me.
Yeah.
And, you go multiple years in a row and then you know multiple people within 20 feet of you. But you go to DEF CON and it's not that at all. And I think it kind of, I tried it on Discord, but it just kind of got worse. Where like, you're like, oh, here's all these people behind usernames that you don't know. So I think the niche conferences are really the best.
Yeah.
Especially live.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think Mac Sysadmin might work out because of that. Like, it's a very specific crowd that kind of goes to that event. Like it's a repeat audience, more or less. So we'll see. Henry reminded me in the channel that JNUC is 2 weeks ahead of Mac Sysadmin. I always forget about JNUC because it's not my conference, but it's another big conference that people attend. So yeah, JNUC's right around that time, I guess 2 weeks ahead. I can't think of anything else. Mac Tech got pushed off to next year to hopefully be a live event. So we'll see how that works out.
I think the first live event, everyone will show up to, no matter which one it is.
Yeah, I think yeah, there's definitely pent up demand for that. So
I feel like Europe is gonna have a live event without us, though.
Yeah, no doubt.
That's looking very real.
Just because I don't want to skip it, there was one comment that kind of came in after we shifted topics, but sort of back to the user enrollment. Nathan Buck again says in the comments, I'd like to see macOS supervised enrollment present a web view-like dialog instead of the limited username and password fixed dialog. The latter breaks our MFA process. I guess that makes sense.
So I think you can do that now.
I think you can now. I think there is a way to do that.
I don't know if it's for user enrollment, but for device enrollment, you can definitely do that. It's a different auth flow, but it doesn't work with security keys. But if you use any other method, that should work at this time.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're doing some other 2FA, I'm pretty sure that does work now. But I think the comment stands in terms of like, it's still less than perfect.
Yeah, it's there. But we need web authentication support.
Yeah, that would be really nice. Security, web authn, security keys, web authn support. And we'll see. We're getting basically a little mini Safari as the web view, so maybe we'll get that in the web view. All right. Any other questions?
Maybe in a future macOS release.
Maybe. Which
macOS 12, 13, maybe. We'll see.
Any other questions? Things people want to address?
How's the beta testing going for Big Sur?
What's that?
How far are folks into their Big Sur testing process?
Not far.
I mean, I have it on all my stuff. I think everything that we need to work works. We could get away with shipping it now, probably. The biggest thing for us that doesn't work is crypt, the crypt's authorization plugin. But I think we could get away without having that. But pretty much everything at this point, I think we're on beta 4 now. It just works. Steam still has some problems, but I think they just released a new version. So like, I think the problems I have aren't really related to work stuff.
I keep finding that Apple just breaks, like really stupidly breaks the tools that I have that we rely on in provisioning, and they're not like the end of the world. Like just like Sam said, the process, like everything seems to be mostly working, but then like in the last beta, the really ridiculous thing that I did is, you know how everybody has $3 or $1 to check for different arguments for installer and post-install scripts. Like they changed all of those paths, but only when a package was being installed with the MDM client. So we had to redo all of the MDM client-related installs. And then I fixed it because I reported it, like, why did you break it? And they also, like, in the most recent one, they broke. So if you called kex download in previous releases, you would get detailed exit codes to like signify whether the kex wasn't found or whether it was some other issue, right? So we have our tools that install system extensions or kernel extensions or whatever are doing these downloading. They wrapped all of that into they wrapped kex download into a new tool that completely does not care about the exit codes of the old tool. So all of the things that shouldn't be a failure now result in exceptions all over the place. And it's like, do we fix those, or do we report it and hope that Apple fixes it in the next beta because they're paying attention? But yeah, a lot of it is. Sorry, I'm ranting.
That's what I expect. That, come on.
It's just a lot of it is like Apple breaks things and waits for us to like notice and report that they're broken. Otherwise, they're not broken, right?
I think we've worked around everything, or there were some things that broke that we, were on the list of things to fix that we knew were going to break. But then there were a lot of things that didn't break. Like Apple kept shipping Python 2. And you're like, oh, all this stuff that we updated to run on our vendor Python 3, I guess we didn't have to do that, but at least we know it works more consistently now.
Do you have any expectations that the user-approved kernel extension profile in MDM is going to keep working? Or do you have, like, there's been some changes, and the current status is that users get prompted anyway and they have to reboot.
It seems like the prompt changed so that it's not really a user-approved like kernel extension loading. It's just because you have to reboot for kex to load. It's just a change there, and that it's more of like a graph. It's just like a text, like what should the text say versus how it actually works. So Apple is purposefully making it more painful to use kex. But I think it's more like a user-approved reboot now than like a user-approved kernel loading. At least what I see.
Yeah, I think it relates all to the DTK and Silicon. I think there are changes there. While from like the admin side, it looks like, oh, they're just forcing users to have to reboot to kind of annoy them. I think it probably partially has to do with as they're looking forward to the ARM architecture, the more iOS style, that, yeah, it's just kind of like, in order for us to build this thing so that it's a securely booted and verified, we need the kernel extension installed and then rebooted so that we can build this sort of verified secure thing to then boot back up. So I agree. I think it's going to stay. Even if the profile gets sent down, you're going to have to reboot, because I think that's just how they want it to work for security reasons more than annoying people to get off of kernel extensions.
Yeah, and it does work that way on Intel Macs as well. You must reboot for kex to load.
Yeah.
I agree that a good security property, like, you're being very explicit that, like, you can't just load this thing in the background without anyone knowing. It's like very something's happening. So I like that. I'm not convinced there's no way around it, but
it's just a bad experience for users, because none of the kernel extensions that we load are things that most of them are aware of or care about what they do, right? So suddenly they're getting these prompts, which we've trained them in the past to not click on prompts to allow things, and now it's like, well, go do this. Why? Because, yeah.
You just send an MDM command to reboot the device, and then that'll just work, right?
It does just work, and that's why I don't send it. But, yeah.
All right. Any other comments, questions? Okay. Thanks again, Sam. Thanks everyone for showing up, and another MacAdmin Monthly in the books. See everyone
in September.
Yeah, see you in
Oh
September.
my God, it'll be September.
Or
Where's
March.
this year going?
I think it seemed like it stalled for a little bit, and now it's just like sort of all catching up at once. So,
All right.
all right. Thanks again, everybody.
See ya.
Oh.